In 1961, only months after the trial of Adolf Eichmann began in Jerusalem, psychologist Stanley Milgram initiated a study at Yale University that would become one of the most controversial experiments in modern psychology. The world was still grappling with a disturbing question: how had ordinary citizens participated in the machinery of genocide? How could so many claim they were just following orders? Milgram wanted to examine obedience not in dictatorships, not in war zones, but in a controlled academic setting, with ordinary American citizens. Participants were recruited through newspaper ads. They were told the experiment concerned the effects of punishment on learning. For their time, they would receive a modest payment regardless of what happened during the study. That detail was important. They were not being paid to perform well. They were simply being paid to participate. When they arrived at the laboratory, they met two people: another volunteer and the experimenter, a calm, composed man wearing a grey lab coat. The other volunteer was, in reality, an actor working with Milgram. Roles were assigned through what appeared to be a random draw. In truth, it was rigged. The real participant was always assigned the role of teacher. The actor was always the learner. The learner was escorted into an adjacent room and strapped into a chair. Electrodes were attached to his wrist. He mentioned, casually but audibly, that he had a heart condition. The teacher watched this process. It was deliberate. It planted doubt. The teacher was then seated in front of a shock generator, a machine with 30 switches labeled in 15-volt increments, ranging from 15 volts to 450 volts. Beneath the numbers were descriptive labels: slight shock, moderate shock, strong shock, very strong shock, intense shock, extreme intensity shock, danger, severe shock, and finally, simply, XXX. The task was simple. The teacher would read word pairs. If the learner answered incorrectly, the teacher was instructed to administer a shock, increasing the voltage each time. At first, the learner responded normally. Mistakes resulted in small shocks. Mild grunts followed. At 75 volts, he began to complain of pain. At 120 volts, he shouted that the shocks were becoming intolerable. At 150 volts, he demanded to be released from the experiment. The teacher often paused at this point. Many turned toward the experimenter, visibly uncomfortable. The experimenter responded with standardized prompts. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. The tone was calm. There were no threats. No raised voices. Just quiet insistence. As the voltage increased, the learner's protests intensified. He pounded on the wall. He screamed about his heart. At 300 volts, he refused to answer further questions. After 330 volts, he fell silent. Silence was scripted as an incorrect response. The teacher was instructed to continue administering shocks. Participants exhibited a wide range of reactions. Some laughed nervously, a stress response. Some trembled. Some wiped sweat from their brows. Others protested verbally, insisting the learner be checked on. A few refused to continue, but many did. In the original baseline condition, 65% of participants administered the maximum 450-volt shock. Not because they were sadistic. In fact, follow-up interviews suggested the opposite. Most were deeply distressed. Many expressed relief when told the learner had not actually been harmed. Milgram concluded that participants entered what he termed an agentic state, a psychological condition in which individuals perceive themselves as instruments executing the wishes of an authority figure. Responsibility shifts upward. Moral agency becomes diffused. But the experiment did not stop there. Milgram conducted numerous variations. When the authority figure was physically present, obedience was high. When instructions were delivered by telephone, obedience dropped. When participants were required to physically force the learner's hand onto a shock plate, compliance decreased further. When two experimenters disagreed, obedience collapsed dramatically. Perhaps most revealing, When peers refused to continue, the majority of participants also refused. Authority mattered. Proximity mattered. Social context mattered. The results suggested that obedience is not merely a personality trait. It is situational, structural, embedded within hierarchies. The experiment triggered immediate ethical controversy. Critics argued that participants were subjected to extreme psychological stress. Some reportedly experienced lasting emotional disturbance. The deception was profound. Individuals believed they might have seriously harmed another person. In response to the backlash, institutional review boards became standard practice in psychological research. Modern ethics guidelines were shaped, in part, by Milgram's methods. But controversy did not end there. Over the decades, alternative interpretations emerged. Some scholars argued that participants were not blindly obedient, but rather trusted the institution of Yale University. They believed the experimenter would not allow real harm. Others suggested that participants may have doubted the authenticity of the shocks. In 2009, archival analysis of audio recordings revealed that some participants questioned the setup. However, even accounting for skepticism, obedience rates remained disturbingly high. More recent reinterpretations propose that participants identified with the scientific mission. Rather than feeling coerced, they felt aligned with the authorities' stated goal of advancing knowledge. This reframes the experiment not as passive obedience, but as motivated compliance. Beyond academic debate, the Milgram experiment fueled cultural anxiety. It became shorthand for institutional cruelty. It was cited in discussions of war crimes, corporate misconduct, and bureaucratic complicity. Conspiracy theorists later linked Milgram's findings to intelligence programs such as MKUltra, suggesting psychological obedience research was used to refine interrogation techniques. While no direct operational link has been established, the broader Cold War climate of behavioral research added to suspicions. The experiment's imagery, the shock machine, the silent learner, the lab-coated authority, became symbolic of a deeper fear that systems, not individuals, are the true engines of harm. Milgram's work suggests something uncomfortable. Evil does not always require hatred. It may require structure, hierarchy, a legitimized chain of command. When authority assumes responsibility, individuals often relinquish it. The Milgram experiment did not prove that humans are inherently cruel. It demonstrated that under specific conditions, credible authority, gradual escalation, diffusion of responsibility, ordinary individuals can override personal moral hesitation. The implications extend beyond laboratories. In military structures, in corporate hierarchies, in political regimes, in bureaucratic systems. The question remains unsettled. If placed in the same position inside a respected institution, guided by a confident authority figure, told that harm serves a greater purpose, would we stop? Or would we continue, one switch at a time?